I am Sienna, 31 years old, and today I buried my father. In court a few weeks from now, my stepmother would argue that I was not mature enough and did not know how to manage money. Her lawyer would grin broadly as they tried to take my bank accounts, my car, and even my apartment. Then the court clerk would open the file and begin reading out the list of my assets. By the fourth item, the judge would suddenly flinch, his eyes widening. He would shout for security and demand the media leave the room. My stepmother would be left completely speechless. What she did not know was that I was not just a struggling IT worker. I was a lead cyber forensic investigator for the federal government. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt abandoned by the people who should have protected you. The heavy, humid summer heat of Atlanta pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my father Harrison's Buckhead mansion. My stepmother, Valerie, had turned his repast into a high-society networking event. Waiters in crisp white shirts floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of shrimp and champagne. I sat quietly at a corner table wearing a simple black dress. I was minding my own business, trying to process the fact that my father was really gone. Then a thick stack of legal papers slammed down right on top of my plate. I looked up to see Valerie standing over me. She wore a custom black designer suit. Her makeup was flawless, and her expression was filled with pure contempt. "Sign this asset surrender form right now, Sienna," she commanded, her voice carrying easily over the soft jazz playing in the background. Several wealthy guests turned their heads to watch us. I looked at the papers and then back at her. "What are you talking about, Valerie? My father just went into the ground 3 hours ago." She crossed her arms and leaned in closer, making sure the nearby guests could hear every word. "You are mentally unstable and financially incompetent," she announced loudly. "You cannot even keep a real corporate job. You fix computers for minimum wage at some random desk. There is absolutely no way I am letting you ruin Harrison's legacy or waste your biological mother's inheritance. I need to take over your finances for your own good." I stared at her, taking in the sheer audacity of her actions. My biological mother had left me a modest but meaningful inheritance when she passed away years ago. Valerie had always hated that she had no control over it. Now she was using his death as a weapon to strip away my independence. "You have absolutely no right to touch my mother's money or my share of this estate," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I am an adult. I manage my own life." Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Manage your own life," she repeated, gesturing toward my outfit. "Look at you. You drive a beat-up sedan and live in a tiny apartment. Your father constantly worried about your lack of ambition. He built an empire, and his eldest daughter is a glorified tech support worker. It is embarrassing." I stood up slowly. My father was proud of the work I do. Just because I do not flash wealth like you do does not mean I am failing. I pushed the legal documents back across the table. "I am not signing anything, Valerie. If you have an issue with my inheritance, you can speak to my lawyer." I grabbed my purse and walked away from her, heading straight toward the catering manager. The repast was winding down, and I had promised my father before he died that I would handle the final payments for his memorial services. It was the last thing I could do for him. I approached the catering manager near the kitchen entrance. "Thank you for everything today," I said, pulling my credit card from my wallet. "The food was beautiful. I would like to settle the final balance now." The manager smiled sympathetically and took my card. He swiped it through his portable terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, negative sound. He frowned and tried inserting the chip. Another sharp beep followed. "I am so sorry, miss," he said, looking uncomfortable. "It says the card is declined." I frowned, pulling out a different card from a completely separate bank. "That is impossible. Try this one, please." He ran the second card. Declined again. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew exactly how much money was in those accounts. I had carefully managed my finances for years. There was no logical reason for a decline. "It looks like the IT worker cannot even afford to pay for appetizers." Valerie's voice dripped with fake pity as she stepped up right beside me. She handed the catering manager a sleek black metal credit card. Put the entire balance on my account, please. The manager quickly processed her card and retreated into the kitchen to escape the tension. I turned to face my stepmother, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. "What did you do?" I asked softly. Valerie smiled a chilling, predatory smile that confirmed all my worst fears. She stepped so close I could smell her expensive perfume. "I told you I am taking over your finances for your own good," she whispered. "I had my lawyer file an emergency petition this morning. All of your bank accounts are officially frozen. Your credit cards are dead. You have absolutely zero access to your mother's inheritance or your own savings until a judge grants me full conservatorship." I stood perfectly still, processing the magnitude of her betrayal. She had planned this ambush perfectly, timing it to hit me when I was most vulnerable. She wanted me desperate and trapped and helpless. "Sign the papers," Sienna. Valerie said, her eyes flashing with triumph. "Sign over your assets to my control, or you will not even have enough money to buy dinner tonight. You will be sleeping on the street in the cold dark by the end of the week." She turned around and simply walked away, laughing softly. The secure government alert glowing on my burner phone told me everything I needed to know about Carter and his sudden interest in my finances. They were not just trying to take my inheritance, but they were actively trying to steal my identity. The notification warned me of an unauthorized access attempt on my social security number, coming directly from his internet protocol address. I shoved the phone deep into my dark leather bag and walked away from the country club without looking back. My next stop was downtown Atlanta to see Arthur Sterling. Arthur had been the estate lawyer for my father for over 2 decades. He drafted the original will and managed the trust my biological mother left for me. If anyone could stop Valerie from freezing my bank accounts, it was him. I drove my beat-up sedan through the heavy city traffic, letting the rhythm of the road calm my racing thoughts. I needed to play this perfectly. As a federal cyber forensic investigator, I was highly trained to handle high-pressure interrogations with dangerous criminals, but today, I had to be Sienna, the helpless desk worker. I parked in a cheap public lot a few blocks away from the business district and walked toward his pristine glass office building. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, making the air feel thick and suffocating. The receptionist made me wait for over an hour in the cold, stiff leather chairs of the lobby. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to make me feel small and insignificant. I used the time to mentally catalog everything I knew about Arthur and his financial practices. When he finally allowed me into his massive corner office, he did not even bother to stand up to greet me. He did not offer his condolences for my father, who had just been put into the ground that very morning. He just sat behind his massive polished mahogany desk and peered at me over the rim of his expensive designer glasses. He looked at my simple black morning dress with absolute disdain, as if my mere presence in his luxurious office was a personal insult. I took a seat uninvited and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I asked him to explain exactly why my personal checking accounts were frozen. I reminded him that the money from my biological mother had absolutely nothing to do with Valerie or the new estate of my father. Arthur sighed heavily, as if I were a foolish child asking a profoundly stupid question. He leaned back in his plush leather chair and steepled his fingers together in a gesture of false patience. He told me that Valerie was now the sole executor of the estate, and she had full legal authority to evaluate all family assets. He explained that my stepmother had raised serious legal concerns about my mental stability and my overall financial competence. According to Arthur, my inability to hold a high-paying corporate job was undeniable proof that I could not be trusted with a substantial sum of money. He said that fixing computers for minimum wage showed a severe lack of basic life skills. I acted shocked and let my voice tremble just a little bit to sell the performance. I asked him how he could possibly betray the wishes of my father after 20 years of close friendship and business partnership. Arthur smiled a thin, greedy smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He informed me that loyalty was a very fluid concept in the modern business world. Valerie had officially restructured the family trust that very morning while I was busy mourning at the funeral. She had made Arthur a managing partner with a very lucrative percentage of the total assets. He had gladly sold out my father and my entire future for a bigger slice of the financial pie. He opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a heavy stack of legal papers. He slid them across the polished wood of his desk, stopping right in front of me. I looked down at the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. It was a formal petition for a permanent conservatorship. Valerie was not just trying to hold my money hostage until I surrendered the inheritance from my biological mother. She was officially petitioning the state of Georgia to declare me legally incompetent. If a judge actually signed this sweeping order, Valerie would have absolute control over every single aspect of my life. She would dictate where I lived and what I spent, and even make all of my medical decisions. She wanted to completely erase my existence as an independent adult and reduce me to a ward of the state. I let out a soft, believable gasp and forced a few desperate tears to pool in my eyes. I slumped forward in my chair, pretending to be completely broken and overwhelmed by the crushing weight of this terrible document. Arthur watched my fake despair with obvious personal satisfaction. He leaned forward and began to lecture me about how the real world actually works for weak people like me. He told me that I should just sign the paperwork immediately and let Valerie take care of all my complicated adult responsibilities. He promised they would give me a small monthly allowance so I could keep fixing computers in peace without ever having to worry about big financial decisions again. I kept my head bowed low and let a single perfect tear roll down my cheek to complete the performance of a defeated sister. But while Arthur continued his long, arrogant speech, my eyes were busy working in secret. My intense federal training had taught me exactly how to read complex documents upside down in a fraction of a second. I scanned the chaotic mess of legal papers scattered across the far corner of his desk. My forensic gaze locked onto a specific legal form partially hidden under a half-empty coffee mug. The name printed at the top belonged to my incredibly arrogant brother-in-law, Carter. It was an official federal bankruptcy filing complete with court seals and routing numbers. Carter had been loudly bragging all afternoon to anyone who would listen about his multi-million-dollar crypto firm and his massive untouchable wealth. But the official court document sitting right there on the desk of the lawyer told a completely different story. His supposedly successful crypto company was entirely insolvent and currently drowning in massive unpayable debt. Carter was not a wealthy crypto genius at all. Carter was completely broke. I left Arthur's office with my heart hammering, but my mind incredibly clear. The puzzle pieces were snapping together. Carter was bankrupt. His flashy crypto firm was a massive sinking ship. That meant the family fortune my father spent a lifetime building was likely gone drained by a son-in-law playing games with money he did not earn. Valerie was not trying to steal my biological mother's inheritance just because she was greedy. She was doing it because she was desperate. They needed liquid assets immediately to cover whatever financial crater Carter had dug. My clean accounts were the perfect target to keep their extravagant lifestyle afloat. I hurried to my parked sedan, checking my rearview mirror out of instinct. If Valerie was desperate enough to buy off a lawyer and file a conservatorship within hours of the funeral, there was no telling how far she would go. I needed to get to my apartment and secure the physical deed to my mother's house before she found a way to leverage that too. The drive across town felt agonizingly slow. When I finally pulled into the crumbling asphalt parking lot of my modest apartment complex, my trained eyes caught something out of place. A massive, glossy black sports utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows was idling next to the dumpsters. It was the kind of vehicle private security firms used for discreet transport and intimidation. It did not belong in my working-class neighborhood. I killed the engine and grabbed my heavy canvas gym bag from the passenger seat. My pulse quickened as I climbed the 3 flights of concrete stairs to my floor. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet, just like it always did, but the silence felt heavy. When I rounded the corner to my unit, my breath hitched in my throat. The wooden door frame was completely splintered into jagged pieces of pine. The door itself was pushed wide open. I stepped into the doorway and felt a cold wave of pure, calculated rage wash over me. Two massive men in matching dark suits were systematically destroying my home. They were not common burglars looking for quick cash. Their movements were far too calculated. One of them was slicing open the bottom of my living room sofa cushions with a hunting knife and tossing the foam onto the floor. The other man was in my kitchenette violently sweeping my dishes and carefully organized mail off the counter, letting everything shatter onto the linoleum tile. They were tossing my belongings like garbage. "Excuse me," I demanded, keeping my voice pitched to sound like a terrified civilian instead of a federal agent. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" The man in the kitchen turned around slowly, brushing dust off his tailored jacket. He pulled a folded piece of heavy legal paper from his inner pocket and flicked it open. "Sienna Harrison," he stated, reading my name aloud. "We are private asset recovery contractors hired directly by Valerie Harrison. You are currently trespassing on an active estate investigation site." I stared at the absolute devastation, pretending to be completely overwhelmed. Books I had owned since college were ripped from their shelves. My modest television was shoved face down on the rug. They were looking for something specific. "You have no legal right to be here," I said, letting my voice waver, simulating panic. "This is my private residence. I rent this apartment." The second man dropped a couch cushion and laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "You do not own or rent anything anymore, little girl," he sneered, stepping uncomfortably close to me. "Your stepmother filed a conservatorship this morning. We have explicit orders from her legal team to secure this property and locate the physical deed to the residential property held in your name. She knows you are hiding the paperwork for your biological mother's house somewhere in this dump. We are not leaving until we find it." I wrapped my arms around myself, acting like a frightened, cornered animal. "You cannot just break down my door and go through my things," I pleaded, stepping backward into the hallway. The first man sighed heavily and signaled to his partner. "We can do whatever the conservator tells us to do," he explained. "Valerie said you were mentally unstable and prone to losing important financial documents." She was right. Look at this sad, pathetic little place. You clearly cannot take care of yourself. Now grab your gym bag and get out before we call the local police and have you arrested for interfering with a property seizure. Before I could formulate another fake protest, the second man grabbed my arm and forcefully shoved me backward out into the hallway. I stumbled deliberately, letting my shoulder hit the rough textured wall to sell the performance of a weak and defeated woman. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy industrial padlock and a cordless drill. Within 90 seconds, he had installed a massive steel hasp directly over the broken doorframe, completely locking me out of my own home. They did not even let me grab a toothbrush or a change of clothes. "You can sleep in your car tonight," the first man said through the crack in the door, his voice dripping with condescension. "Valerie says it will build character and teach you a lesson about respect." Then he slammed the broken door shut, leaving me alone in the dim, flickering light of the apartment hallway. I listened to the heavy padlock click securely into place. I slowly pushed myself off the wall and walked down the 3 flights of stairs. I stepped out into the humid evening air and walked down the cracked sidewalk until the black sports utility vehicle was completely out of sight. A normal person would have been weeping right now. A normal person would have felt their entire world collapsing into a pile of helpless dust. But I just stood there on the pavement, under the fading glow of the street lamp, and smiled. It was a genuine, cold, and calculating smile. I reached down and slowly unzipped the heavy canvas gym bag I had carried with me all afternoon. Nestled safely between my workout clothes was a thick, matte black laptop. It possessed no brand logos and no standard operating system. It was a highly classified, heavily encrypted terminal issued directly by the United States Treasury Department. Valerie thought she had stripped me of all my resources and left me with absolutely nothing. I pulled the heavy machine from the bag and traced my fingers over the glowing biometric scanner. They broke into the wrong house. I hailed a cab and directed the driver to a nondescript extended stay hotel on the outskirts of the city. I paid for 3 nights in cash, using a completely untraceable alias. The room was aggressively ordinary, featuring beige walls, a generic floral bedspread, and a small laminate desk facing a parking lot. It was the perfect operational base. I locked the deadbolt, secured the chain, and pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut. The moment I placed my encrypted laptop on the desk, the sterile room transformed into a secure federal workspace. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner and watched the screen flare to life. The complex layers of security protocols automatically engaged, connecting me directly to the restricted databases of the United States Treasury Department. Valerie and her hired muscle thought they had successfully severed me from the world by locking me out of my apartment and freezing my personal bank accounts. They truly believed I was sitting in my car somewhere, crying over my empty wallet. They had absolutely no idea that my real resources were limitless. I began my work by running a standard diagnostic sweep. I needed to establish exactly what my stepmother and my sister were doing while I was setting up my secure network. I typed a series of commands to monitor the digital footprint of my family members. I expected to find more legal filings, or perhaps a trail of frantic bank transfers from Carter trying to cover his massive debts. Instead, my screen suddenly flooded with high-priority alerts regarding my own name. The tracking software indicated a massive, unprecedented spike in social media traffic centered entirely around me. My digital reputation was being systematically dismantled in real time. I bypassed several firewalls and routed my connection through a proxy server to safely view the public platforms without logging my location. What I found made my blood run absolutely cold. Brianna, my perfectly polished, spoiled half-sister, had launched a highly coordinated viral smear campaign. She had posted a video on her primary social media channels that was already racking up hundreds of thousands of views. I clicked play and watched the performance of a lifetime. Brianna was sitting on the grand staircase of our father's mansion, wearing an oversized sweater to look fragile and vulnerable. She had stripped away her usual heavy makeup and allowed her hair to look slightly messy. She was weeping directly into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She told her massive audience that our father had just passed away and that the family was completely heartbroken. Then she took a deep, shaky breath and delivered the fatal blow. She looked straight into the lens and claimed that I had been secretly stealing money from our dying father for years. Brianna wiped away a fake tear and told the world that I suffered from a severe and uncontrollable gambling addiction. She spun a tragic, heartbreaking narrative about how my father had tried everything to save me, but my sickness had completely consumed me. She lied with absolute ease, claiming I had drained his emergency medical funds to feed my dangerous habits, and that I had become violent and unpredictable when confronted. She begged her followers for prayers and support, stating that the family was now being forced to take legal action to protect me from myself. She was publicly laying the exact emotional groundwork Valerie needed to justify the conservatorship petition. By painting me as a deranged thief and a degenerate gambler, they were providing the judge with a perfect, tidy excuse to strip away my rights. But Brianna did not stop at mere character assassination. She had directly linked a crowdfunding page to the viral video. The page was titled, "Save the Harrison Family Legacy." She was actively soliciting donations from strangers, claiming the money would be used to recover the funds I had allegedly stolen and to pay for my involuntary rehabilitation. I watched the donation counter tick upward in real time. People were sending $10, $20, $50 at a time, accompanied by comments expressing deep sympathy for Brianna and absolute disgust for me. Former high school classmates, family friends, and even distant relatives were leaving brutal messages calling me a monster and a disgrace to my father's memory. They were successfully destroying my public reputation brick by brick, ensuring that no one in our social circle would ever believe a single word I said. The sheer calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. I sat back in the cheap hotel chair and analyzed their strategy with cold professional detachment. Valerie and Carter were drowning in massive cartel debt. They needed immediate liquid cash, and they needed absolute control over my clean assets to survive. By launching this massive public smear campaign, they were guaranteeing that I would be totally isolated. If I tried to ask anyone for help or tried to tell the truth about Carter losing the family fortune, everyone would simply dismiss me as a desperate lying addict trying to cover her tracks. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless manipulation of public sympathy. I placed my hands over the keyboard, ready to initiate a full federal trace on the crowdfunding account. I wanted to see exactly which offshore bank Carter was using to catch the incoming donations. Before I could strike a single key, my burner phone vibrated violently against the laminate desk. The harsh buzzing sound shattered the quiet focus of the room. I picked up the cheap plastic device and tapped the screen. It was a picture message sent directly from Carter. My breath caught in my throat as the image loaded. It was a harsh, poorly lit photograph of my biological mother's antique gold wedding ring resting on the dirty dashboard of his sports car. It was the one irreplaceable item I had kept hidden in my apartment safe, locked away from the greedy hands of my stepmother. The one thing I treasured above everything else in the world, because it was the only physical connection I had left to the woman who actually loved me. I stared at the delicate vintage engraving on the gold band, feeling a sudden sharp spike of genuine panic pierce through my calm exterior. They had absolutely ransacked my sanctuary and taken the only piece of my history that mattered. A secondary text message popped up immediately below the photograph, glaring brightly against the dark screen of the burner phone. The words were simple, clear, and completely devastating. "Sign the conservatorship tomorrow morning, or I pawn this." I stared at the glowing screen of my burner phone, reading his threat over and over again. Carter thought he was holding all the cards. He thought taking my mother's ring would break me and force me into submission. Instead, he had just handed me the exact leverage I needed to destroy him. I typed a quick, desperate-sounding reply, begging him not to pawn the ring and asking to meet him in person to discuss the conservatorship. I suggested an upscale coffee shop in Buckhead for early the next morning. He replied a minute later with a single word confirming the meeting. I spent the rest of the night in my secure hotel room preparing my equipment. I carefully threaded a microscopic federal recording device into the collar of my simple gray blouse. It was standard issue for undercover operatives, capturing flawless, high-definition audio and video that uploaded directly to a secure government cloud server in real time. The military-grade audio filter was specifically designed to isolate voices and cut through heavy background noise. There would be no physical tape for him to find and no way to erase the evidence once it was captured. The morning sun was bright and blinding as I walked into the crowded coffee shop. The air was thick with the smell of roasted espresso beans and expensive perfume. I found a small round table in the far corner, perfectly positioned to keep my back against the wall, while providing the hidden camera an unobstructed view of the seat across from me. The clinking of ceramic mugs and the loud hiss of the espresso machine created the perfect cover for a private conversation. Carter arrived 20 minutes late, perfectly fitting his arrogant persona. He walked through the heavy glass doors wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold watch that I now knew he could not actually afford. He scanned the room with a look of absolute superiority, treating the baristas and the other customers like they were invisible peasants. When he finally spotted me in the corner, he grabbed a metal chair and dragged it out, sitting down heavily without offering any kind of greeting. He did not even bother to buy a coffee. He just leaned back and crossed his arms, staring at me with a sickeningly smug expression on his face. I immediately hunched my shoulders forward and let my hands tremble as they rested on the small wooden table. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid, perfectly mimicking the physical symptoms of a massive panic attack. "Please, Carter," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured fear. "Please, just give me back the ring. It is the only thing I have left of my mother. You cannot take her house, too. I will do whatever you want, just leave my property alone." I let a few tears spill over my eyelashes and slowly run down my cheeks. It was a flawless performance born from years of studying the psychology of desperate victims during my federal investigations. Carter drank in my tears like fine wine. His smile widened, showing perfectly white teeth, as he leaned across the small table. He loved feeling powerful. He loved seeing me broken and begging. He told me to stop crying and start acting like an adult. He said that this was simply how the real world worked for weak people like me. He lectured me about my complete lack of ambition and my pathetic little life fixing computers for minimum wage. He said that people who did not understand how to leverage money did not deserve to keep it. According to Carter, my biological mother had made a terrible mistake, leaving her assets to someone so completely financially incompetent. He told me that Valerie was actually doing me a massive favor by taking over my life and my bank accounts. He promised that if I signed the conservatorship papers quietly, they would give me a tiny weekly allowance so I could buy my little tech gadgets and pretend to be independent. He spoke with such absolute conviction that a normal person might have actually believed his twisted logic and surrendered completely. I sniffled and wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, keeping the camera lens perfectly focused on his face. I asked him why they needed my specific money so badly if he was already a multi-million-dollar crypto genius. I reminded him that my father had left behind a massive corporate empire and that my small inheritance should mean absolutely nothing to a wealthy man like him. I intentionally bruised his massive ego, knowing that narcissists simply cannot resist an opportunity to brag about their own perceived brilliance. I asked him if his crypto company was in trouble, or if he was just not as smart as he claimed to be. His eyes flashed with sudden fierce anger, and he leaned in so close I could smell the strong mint of his expensive aftershave. He told me that I was a stupid girl who did not understand high-level corporate finance or the complexities of modern wealth management. Carter could not stop himself from taking the bait. He desperately needed to prove that he was the smartest man in the room. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper, but the federal microphone in my collar captured every single syllable with crystal-clear precision. He bragged that he was a financial visionary who just needed a temporary bridge loan to cover a minor liquidity issue in his firm. He admitted that the traditional banks had refused to lend him the capital he needed, so he had to take matters into his own hands. A nasty, arrogant grin spread across his face as he leaned even closer over the table. He confessed that he had personally forged the signature of my father on a massive commercial loan document. He proudly explained how easy it was to slip the paperwork into a stack of routine estate documents while my father was heavily medicated in the hospital to secure $10 million in completely unauthorized funds. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had outsmarted the entire banking system without leaving a single trace. But then his smile faltered just a fraction as the reality of his situation bled through his deep arrogance. He admitted that the crypto market had unexpectedly crashed, and the $10 million was completely gone forever. The federal bank examiners were starting to ask very uncomfortable questions, and his firm was officially bankrupt. He looked me dead in the eye and stated that my mother's house and my untouched bank accounts were the only clean liquid assets left that could cover the missing $10 million before the fraud investigators figured out what he had done. He needed my money to save himself from a very long sentence in federal prison. He leaned back in his chair looking incredibly satisfied with his little villain speech. He told me that I had absolutely no choice but to sign the conservatorship immediately, or he would pawn my mother's ring and leave me sleeping on the streets. He thought he had me completely trapped in his web of lies and blackmail. He had absolutely no idea that he had just confessed to a massive $10 million federal bank fraud directly into the microphone of a lead cyber forensic investigator. I left Carter sitting at that small round table, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. He genuinely believed his little coffee shop ambush had broken my spirit completely. I walked out into the bright morning sun and immediately uploaded the encrypted audio file to my secure federal server. I had the definitive confession for the $10 million bank fraud safely locked away, but my biological mother's wedding ring was still in their possession. Carter might have been the one to send the threatening photograph, but I knew perfectly well that Valerie was the true architect of this cruelty. She held the leash, and Carter was just her obedient dog fetching whatever she demanded. I needed to confront the puppet master directly. I pulled up the tracking software on my burner phone and located the digital footprint of Valerie. Her phone was pinging from the exclusive Whispering Pines Country Club in the wealthiest suburban district of Atlanta. I drove straight there, pushing my beat-up sedan to its limits on the highway. The grand entrance to the country club was flanked by towering oak trees and a massive wrought iron gate. I bypassed the valet station, parked my car between two pristine luxury vehicles, and walked straight toward the towering clubhouse. The air smelled strongly of freshly cut grass and expensive cigars. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, completely ignoring the shocked gasp of the hostess, who clearly saw that my simple dark morning clothes did not meet their strict designer dress code. I scanned the crowded dining room and spotted Valerie holding court on the sunlit outdoor terrace. She was sitting at a prime corner table, surrounded by three of her equally wealthy, heavily Botoxed friends. They were sipping mimosas and laughing loudly, completely oblivious to the trail of financial destruction Valerie was leaving in her wake. I marched out onto the terrace, my footsteps echoing sharply against the imported stone tiles. Valerie saw me approaching, and her fake smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer calculating malice. I did not give her a single chance to speak. I slammed my hands down on the edge of her table, rattling the fine china and crystal champagne flutes. I demanded that she give me back my mother's wedding ring immediately. I told her that she could freeze my bank accounts and steal my apartment, but she had absolutely no right to touch a deeply personal family heirloom that predated her entire existence in my father's life. Valerie did not even flinch. Instead, she saw a captive audience and immediately went into a masterclass performance. She let out a loud theatrical gasp and pressed a manicured hand against her chest, looking around at her friends with wide, terrified eyes. She loudly announced that I was the deranged stepdaughter Brianna had warned everyone about on the internet just hours ago. She pitched her voice perfectly so that every single wealthy patron on the terrace could hear her cruel words. She told them that I was suffering from a severe psychotic break fueled by a massive hidden gambling addiction, and that I had been ruthlessly stealing from my poor dying father for years. Her high society friends gasped and clutched their pearls, staring at me with a sickening mixture of absolute disgust and morbid fascination. I stood there playing the part of the desperate cornered addict, perfectly letting my shoulders slump and my breathing grow rapid and ragged. I begged her to just tell Carter to return the ring, promising I would walk away and leave them alone forever. Valerie just laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut right through the polite murmurs of the country club terrace. She signaled frantically for the club security guards who were already rushing across the dining room toward our table. While we waited for the guards to arrive, Valerie leaned back in her chair and decided to gloat. She was so drunk on her own power and the rapt attention of her wealthy friends that she simply could not resist showing off how brilliant she believed she was. She told them that she had already taken extreme measures to protect the family estate from my greedy, drug-addled hands. She boasted loudly that she had completely liquidated the remaining assets of my father and transferred every single cent into a highly secure offshore account. She wanted to prove to her friends that she was an untouchable financial mastermind. She explicitly named the institution, bragging about the impenetrable privacy laws of the Meridian Global Trust in the Cayman Islands. She declared it was the perfect fortress to keep her hard-earned wealth safe from a pathetic thieving stepdaughter. Two massive country club security guards grabbed my arms roughly before I could even respond to her arrogant speech. They gripped me tightly, their heavy fingers digging into my skin as they forcibly turned me around. I did not fight them. I let them drag me backward through the crowded dining room, hanging my head in shame as the entire country club stared and whispered. Valerie shouted after me, telling the guards to make sure the deranged thief was permanently banned from the premises. They hauled me out the front doors and shoved me hard onto the pavement, warning me that they would call the local police if I ever showed my face there again. I stumbled toward my car, keeping my head down until I was safely locked inside the vehicle. The moment the doors locked, my posture changed completely. The fake humiliation vanished instantly, leaving only cold, razor-sharp focus. Valerie thought she had just publicly destroyed me. She thought she had humiliated me in front of her powerful friends and proven her absolute dominance. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed a federal cyber investigator the exact key to her total destruction. I drove back to my secure extended stay hotel, checking my mirrors the entire way to ensure I was not being followed. The moment I was locked safely inside my dark room, I pulled out my heavily encrypted Treasury laptop. I pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner and bypassed the standard firewalls, diving straight into the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network database. As a lead investigator, I had unrestricted access to global banking records that local law enforcement could only dream of seeing. I typed in the name Valerie had so arrogantly dropped at the country club luncheon. Meridian Global Trust in the Cayman Islands. The federal system hummed powerfully as it sliced through layers of international banking privacy shields. I tracked the complex routing numbers, cross-referencing the offshore holding company with the name of my stepmother and my father's newly liquidated estate assets. The screen flooded with glowing green data highlighting massive financial transfers moving rapidly through dozens of fake shell companies. But as I dug deeper into the digital architecture of the Meridian Global Trust, my blood ran completely cold. The specific offshore account Valerie had used to hide my father's money was not just a standard tax haven for wealthy widows trying to avoid the government. The transaction nodes and digital routing protocols matched a highly classified federal signature I had spent the last 3 years of my career tracking. It was a primary money laundering hub for the Sinaloa cartel. Valerie and Carter had not just lost my father's fortune in a bad crypto scheme. They were desperately funneling stolen estate money directly into the bank accounts of a deadly international criminal syndicate. The glowing green text on my screen confirmed my absolute worst fears. Valerie and Carter were not just greedy and financially incompetent, they were actively working with one of the most ruthless and violently dangerous criminal organizations on the entire planet. I sat back in the cheap laminate hotel chair and let the cold reality of the situation wash over me. Carter had managed to lose $10 million of cartel money in a spectacular failed crypto scheme. The cartel was obviously demanding immediate repayment with interest. Valerie was using the fraudulent conservatorship petition to legally steal my clean, untainted assets to pay off their massive debt and save her precious son from a cartel hit squad. They were completely willing to destroy my reputation, steal my inheritance, and lock me away in a psychiatric facility just to save their own skins from the criminals they had foolishly courted. The burning anger I felt was no longer hot and chaotic. It was ice-cold and perfectly focused. I knew exactly what I had to do to stop them. I could not just sit in this hotel room and wait for them to steal my money and finalize the conservatorship. I needed them to commit a crime so massive and so publicly undeniable that no high-priced defense lawyer could ever save them from the consequences. I opened a new encrypted workspace on my laptop and began crafting the perfect digital trap. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out a standard unmarked silver flash drive. I started loading it with highly sensitive personal financial documents. I needed to make this digital bait look absolutely irresistible to a desperate and greedy woman like Valerie. I created a master spreadsheet titled Confidential Personal Asset Inventory and placed it right in the main directory of the drive so it would be the very first thing she saw when she plugged it in. I carefully typed in the routing and account numbers for my 3 real personal savings accounts. I included the exact current balances showing the modest but very real sums I had managed to save over my years of undercover federal service. By giving them my actual accounts, I was selling the absolute authenticity of the entire document. Valerie would immediately verify these first 3 accounts, and her overwhelming greed would completely blind her to any potential danger lurking below. She would see the real money and assume the rest of the document was just as legitimate. Then I slowly scrolled down and added the 4th account. I placed it at the very bottom of the spreadsheet, labeling it as a restricted emergency trust established quietly by my late father before his passing. I typed in a very specific and highly complex string of international routing numbers. This was absolutely not a real trust fund. It was a classified, heavily monitored Federal Reserve honeypot account. It was a digital ghost specifically designed by the Cyber Terrorism Division to track and dismantle global criminal networks. The account was loaded with $50 million of phantom federal funds. To anyone looking from the outside using standard banking software, it appeared to be a massive unprotected offshore trust, just waiting to be claimed by anyone with the right routing numbers. It looked like an abandoned gold mine. But the second anyone attempted to access those funds or initiate an unauthorized transfer, the system would instantly lock down their entire network and flag their exact physical location for an immediate federal raid. It was a digital bear trap, and Valerie was about to step right into it. I safely ejected the silver flash drive and slipped it deep into my pocket. I grabbed a printed copy of the spreadsheet and stamped the word "confidential" across the top in bright red ink. I left my hotel and drove straight to my father's downtown corporate office building. I knew Valerie still used his massive executive suite on the top floor to conduct her shady business deals and pretend she was actually running the company. I used my old security badge, which had somehow not been deactivated yet by human resources, to easily bypass the lobby turnstiles. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it all the way to the top floor, stepping out into the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway. The receptionist was away from her desk, taking her usual late lunch break. I moved quickly and silently down the long hall and slipped smoothly into my father's corner office. The massive room still smelled like his expensive leather chair and the lemon floor wax the cleaning crew used. Seeing Valerie designer coats draped over his furniture made my stomach churn with disgust, but I pushed the emotion aside. I walked directly over to the heavy oak desk and opened the bottom right drawer. I knew from years of observation that Valerie always checked this specific drawer for incoming mail and private courier deliveries the moment she sat down. I placed the silver flash drive inside, pushing it slightly to the back so it looked like I had tried to hide it in a blind panic. I slipped the folded red stamped spreadsheet right underneath it, ensuring she could not possibly miss the bait. I silently closed the heavy wooden drawer and quietly backed out of the executive office. I made it back to the elevator and down to the crowded lobby without a single person noticing my presence. I walked out into the busy city street and drove back to my secure hotel room, feeling a dark and heavy sense of anticipation settling over my shoulders. I opened my laptop and pulled up the classified federal tracking interface for the honeypot account. The screen displayed a simple gray map of the world with a single pulsing blue dot representing the secure phantom funds. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for human nature to take its course. Valerie was incredibly desperate and blindingly greedy. She needed millions of dollars to pay off a cartel and save her son. She would find the silver flash drive, and she would never be able to resist the overwhelming lure of $50 million. She would truly believe she had found my ultimate secret stash and that she had finally beaten me. She would eagerly log in to steal the money, and the very moment she pressed enter the federal trap, would snap completely shut around her neck. I walked into the cold, sterile conference room of the downtown law firm, feeling the heavy weight of the trap I had carefully set. The long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by black leather chairs that looked more like interrogation seats. The air conditioning was turned up so high, it felt like a meat locker intentionally designed to make opposing parties feel physically uncomfortable. Valerie and Carter were already sitting on the far side, whispering to each other with sickeningly confident smiles. Next to them sat their high-priced, aggressive defense attorney, a man who looked like he had built his entire career on crushing vulnerable people and burying their futures in endless legal paperwork. I took my seat alone on the opposite side of the table, playing the part of the isolated and terrified stepdaughter. I kept my head bowed and let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look as small and defenseless as possible. The court reporter sat at the end of the table, her fingers hovering over the stenograph machine ready to capture every single word of my supposed destruction. The deposition began immediately with a brutal and calculated verbal assault. Valerie's lawyer did not waste any time pretending to be polite or professional. He leaned across the wide table and started firing rapid, aggressive questions at me, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. He demanded to know exactly where I had hidden my father's money and why I was fighting the conservatorship so hard if I truly had nothing to hide. When I hesitated, trying to play the part of a confused and overwhelmed victim, he escalated his attacks perfectly on cue. He went on the official record calling me a low IQ dropout who had absolutely no basic understanding of finance or adult responsibility. He claimed I was a completely unstable degenerate who was frantically trying to steal the family legacy before my stepmother could legally secure the estate. He brutally listed all of my alleged personal failures and mocked my simple, quiet life working in computer repair. He told the court reporter to note my silence and my trembling hands as undeniable physical proof of my absolute guilt and mental incompetence. He said I was a parasite draining the life from a successful family. I knew exactly what I had to do to fuel their massive outsized egos. I let my breathing become shallow and deliberately uneven. I brought my hands up to my face and forced hot tears to spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and begged the high-priced lawyer to stop yelling at me. I told him I did not understand all the complex legal terms he was aggressively throwing at me, and that I just wanted to go back to my quiet life and mourn my father in peace. I played the role of the broken, defeated orphan with absolute precision. My performance fed right into their deepest, darkest narcissistic desires. I could see Carter trying to hide a massive, vicious grin, while Valerie simply leaned back in her expensive leather chair, soaking in my manufactured misery. They truly believed they had completely broken my spirit and that the legal conservatorship was basically a done deal. The lawyer smirked and shuffled his thick stack of papers, preparing to deliver what he thought would be the final crushing blow to my credibility and my freedom. But Valerie could not let her hired lawyer take all the glory for my downfall. She desperately needed to be the one holding the knife. She raised her manicured hand and cut her own attorney off mid-sentence, demanding that he let her speak on the record. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her expensive designer dress with a look of absolute unadulterated triumph on her face. She reached into her oversized luxury handbag and slowly pulled out the unmarked silver flash drive I had carefully planted in my father's desk the day before. My heart leaped in my chest, but I forced myself to visibly recoil in sheer horror as she slammed the tiny metal device down onto the center of the heavy mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed through the silent conference room like a gunshot, snapping everyone to attention. Valerie pointed a long, manicured finger directly at my face and announced to the entire room that she had finally caught me red-handed and that my little game was officially over. She loudly declared that they had found my secret digital vault hidden in the back of my father's executive desk. She proudly stated that Carter had easily cracked the drive and discovered a master spreadsheet detailing my massive network of hidden stolen wealth. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and threw it onto the table next to the drive. It was the exact document I had created, stamped with the word "confidential" in bright red ink. She told the court reporter that this specific document contained the routing numbers for my illicit personal accounts where I had been secretly hoarding the millions I stole from my dying father. Valerie looked down at me with pure venom burning in her eyes. She boasted that her legal team was going to submit this exact list of accounts to the presiding judge first thing tomorrow morning. She promised she was going to get an immediate emergency court order to seize every single cent of my hidden millions to pay back the estate I had so greedily drained. I knew it was the perfect time to close the trap completely. I launched myself half out of my chair, reaching a desperate, trembling hand toward the printed spreadsheet resting on the table. I let out a loud, dramatic gasp and started shaking violently from head to toe. I begged Valerie to take everything else, but to please leave the final account on that list, completely alone. I cried harder than before, claiming that the fourth account at the very bottom of the page was my most sacred and secret emergency fund, and that I would be ruined if she touched it. I told her I would sign the conservatorship papers right this second and surrender all my rights if she just promised not to touch or verify that specific fourth account. I acted like a cornered, terrified animal, completely panicked that my ultimate dark secret had been exposed to the world. The silence in the room was deafening as they all stared at my pathetic display of total desperation. Valerie looked down at the paper and then back up at me with dark calculation. A slow, sickeningly evil smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face as she realized just how much pain she could inflict on me. My desperate pleading had acted exactly like blood dropped into shark-infested waters. She snatched the paper back off the table and held it tightly against her chest, refusing to let me near it. She laughed a cold, cruel laugh that chilled the room and told me that she was going to make absolutely certain that her banking contacts drained that fourth account first. She promised to initiate the digital transfer the very second she left the law firm, just to watch me suffer and beg on the streets. She thought she had brilliantly discovered my ultimate financial weakness and completely outsmarted me. She was completely and utterly blinded by her own overwhelming greed and malice. She had absolutely no idea she had just eagerly agreed to trigger a classified Federal Reserve honeypot that would instantly alert the Global Cyber Terrorism Division and bring the full crushing weight of the United States government crashing down on her entire criminal network. I stumbled out of the heavily air-conditioned law firm and into the thick, humid evening air, keeping my head down and my shoulders shaking. The deposition had ended, with Valerie looking like a triumphant queen, completely convinced she had just secured my total financial ruin. I walked slowly toward the dimly lit parking garage across the street, dragging my feet and pulling my thin cardigan tightly around my body to complete the illusion of a defeated woman. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long dark shadows across the concrete pavement and creating a perfect atmosphere for predators to lurk. I knew my stepfamily would not be able to resist one final victory lap before the official court hearing scheduled for the very next morning. They were too arrogant and too deeply addicted to their own cruelty to simply let me walk away quietly. I reached into my pocket and subtly activated the secondary recording device, disguised as a simple car key fob, before stepping into the shadowy structure. I found my beat-up sedan parked on the third level exactly where I had left it, but I was entirely unsurprised to see that I was not alone. Carter and Brianna were leaning casually against a brand-new, sleek black luxury sports car parked directly across from my vehicle. The expensive vehicle was completely paid for with money Carter had stolen from my father's accounts, but he stood there looking like he had earned every single penny through sheer hard work. Brianna was scrolling through her phone, checking her social media engagement from the fake crying video she had posted days earlier. When she heard my footsteps echoing on the concrete, she looked up and nudged her brother with a sharp elbow. They both broke into identical wicked smiles that perfectly mirrored their mother's toxic energy. I stopped in my tracks and took a hesitant step backward, letting out a soft, terrified gasp. Carter pushed himself off the expensive hood of the car and slowly stalked toward me like a predator cornering wounded prey. He clapped his hands together in a slow, mocking rhythm, praising my pathetic performance in the deposition room. He told me that my fake tears were almost convincing enough to make him feel sorry for me if he actually possessed a human conscience. He laughed a deep, booming sound that echoed harshly through the empty parking garage and told me that my absolute financial destruction was basically scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He stepped so close to me that I was forced to press my back against the dirty concrete pillar behind me. Carter bragged that the judge would sign the conservatorship papers without even glancing at my defense because Valerie had thoroughly poisoned my reputation with the legal system. He promised to personally oversee my eviction from my apartment and stated that he would make sure I was completely penniless by noon. He loved the sound of his own voice and the feeling of absolute dominance he thought he held over my life. He leaned down and whispered directly into my ear, detailing exactly how he planned to spend the millions he thought he was stealing from my secret fourth account. He told me he was going to buy a yacht and name it after my dead father just to spit on his memory. He said I would be sleeping in homeless shelters and eating out of dumpsters while he and Valerie flew private jets to the islands. I squeezed my eyes shut and let a fresh wave of tears slide down my cheeks, playing the part of the completely broken stepdaughter. I begged him to leave me just enough money to survive and pleaded with him to remember that we were supposed to be a family. My intentional begging only fueled his massive ego further, causing him to throw his head back and laugh uncontrollably at my total humiliation. Brianna finally decided she was missing out on the fun and strutted over to join us, her designer heels clicking sharply on the dirty floor. She looked me up and down with an expression of sheer revulsion, wrinkling her perfect nose as if I smelled like garbage. She told me I looked absolutely pathetic and that she was doing the world a favor by cleaning up my messy life. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She aggressively crumpled the paper money into a tight ball and threw it directly at my face, letting it bounce off my cheek and fall to the greasy concrete floor. She sneered and told me to use the cash to find a cheap roadside motel for the night, because tomorrow I would officially not have a roof over my head. She told me to enjoy my very last night of freedom before Valerie locked me away in a secure psychiatric ward for my fake gambling addiction. Carter grabbed his sister by the arm and told her not to waste any more time talking to a total loser. He turned his back on me, completely dismissing my existence as if I were nothing more than an annoying insect they had just crushed under their expensive shoes. They walked back to the shiny black car, laughing loudly together and congratulating each other on a brilliantly executed plan. Carter revved the massive engine, sending a deafening roar through the concrete garage before slamming the vehicle into gear. He sped off, leaving black tire marks on the pavement and completely ignoring the strict speed limit. I stayed pressed against the concrete pillar and watched the bright red taillights disappear around the sharp corner of the exit ramp. I waited exactly 30 seconds, listening to the silence returning to the empty parking structure before I finally moved. The moment I was absolutely sure they were gone, my entire physical demeanor shifted. The trembling stopped instantly. The tears dried up completely. I stood up perfectly straight and rolled my shoulders back, shaking off the heavy, suffocating persona of the terrified victim. I stepped forward and deliberately crushed the crumpled $100 bill under the heel of my boot before kicking it into a nearby puddle of dirty motor oil. I walked over to my car and unlocked the door, slipping into the driver's seat and locking it securely behind me. The air inside my car was quiet and safe. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the hidden audio recorder, stopping the capture and instantly uploading the aggressive threats and extortion directly to my secure federal server. They had just provided me with undeniable proof of premeditated financial malice and intent to inflict psychological harm. I placed both hands on the steering wheel and stared out into the dark garage, taking a deep, steadying breath. I was mentally preparing for the massive federal operation that was scheduled for the following morning when the heavy silence of my car was shattered. My secure burner phone began to vibrate violently in the center console. The screen flashed with a restricted alphanumeric sequence that I immediately recognized. It was a highly encrypted, secure line routing directly from federal headquarters in Washington. I snatched the phone up and pressed it tightly against my ear, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the line. The deep, gravelly voice of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division filled the small space inside my vehicle. He did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. His tone was sharp, urgent, and intensely focused. He called me by my official operative title and delivered the exact words I had been desperately waiting to hear for the last 3 years. "Agent," he said, his voice crackling slightly through the encrypted military connection the suspects just attempted to hack the honeypot routing number. I felt a massive surge of pure adrenaline flood my veins as he confirmed that Valerie had taken the digital bait completely. The director informed me that her offshore routing program had just locked onto the phantom $50 million account and initiated a massive unauthorized transfer protocol. He stated that the system had instantly traced her exact coordinates and frozen all connected cartel assets worldwide. A fierce, triumphant smile broke across my face as I stared out into the darkness, because the trap was officially armed, and my family was about to face absolute destruction. The waiting was over, and the day of the pre-trial deposition had finally arrived. I walked into the freezing cold conference room of the downtown law firm, feeling the heavy weight of the performance I was about to give. The long, polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by black leather chairs that looked more like interrogation seats. The air conditioning was turned up so high it felt like a meat locker intentionally designed to make opposing parties feel physically uncomfortable and weak. Valerie and Carter were already sitting on the far side, whispering to each other with sickeningly confident smiles on their faces. Next to them sat their high-priced, aggressive defense attorney, a man who looked like he had built his entire career on crushing vulnerable people and burying their futures in endless legal paperwork. I took my seat alone on the opposite side of the table, playing the part of the isolated and terrified stepdaughter. I kept my head bowed and let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look as small and defenseless as possible. The court reporter sat at the end of the table, her fingers hovering over the stenograph machine, ready to capture every single word of my supposed destruction. The deposition began immediately with a brutal and calculated verbal assault. Valerie's lawyer did not waste any time pretending to be polite or professional. He leaned across the wide table and started firing rapid, aggressive questions at me, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. He demanded to know exactly where I had hidden my father's money and why I was fighting the conservatorship so hard if I truly had nothing to hide. When I hesitated, trying to play the part of a confused and overwhelmed victim, he escalated his attacks perfectly on cue. He went on the official record calling me a low IQ dropout who had absolutely no basic understanding of finance or adult responsibility. He claimed I was a completely unstable degenerate who was frantically trying to steal the family legacy before my stepmother could legally secure the estate. He brutally listed all of my alleged personal failures and mocked my simple, quiet life working in computer repair. He told the court reporter to note my silence and my trembling hands as undeniable physical proof of my absolute guilt and mental incompetence. He said I was a parasite draining the life from a successful family. I knew exactly what I had to do to fuel their massive, outsized egos. I let my breathing become shallow and deliberately uneven. I brought my hands up to my face and forced hot tears to spill over my eyelashes and run down my cheeks. I let out a soft, pathetic sob and begged the high-priced lawyer to stop yelling at me. I told him I did not understand all the complex legal terms he was aggressively throwing at me, and that I just wanted to go back to my quiet life and mourn my father in peace. I played the role of the broken, defeated orphan with absolute precision. My performance fed right into their deepest, darkest narcissistic desires. I could see Carter trying to hide a massive, vicious grin, while Valerie simply leaned back in her expensive leather chair, soaking in my manufactured misery. They truly believed they had completely broken my spirit and that the legal conservatorship was basically a done deal. The lawyer smirked and shuffled his thick stack of papers, preparing to deliver what he thought would be the final crushing blow to my credibility and my freedom. But Valerie could not let her hired lawyer take all the glory for my downfall. She desperately needed to be the one holding the knife. She raised her manicured hand and cut her own attorney off mid-sentence, demanding that he let her speak on the record. She stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her expensive designer dress, with a look of absolute unadulterated triumph on her face. She reached into her oversized luxury handbag and slowly pulled out the unmarked silver flash drive I had carefully planted in my father's desk the day before. My heart leaped in my chest, but I forced myself to visibly recoil in sheer horror as she slammed the tiny metal device down onto the center of the heavy mahogany table. The sharp crack echoed through the silent conference room like a gunshot, snapping everyone to attention. Valerie pointed a long, manicured finger directly at my face and announced to the entire room that she had finally caught me red-handed and that my little game was officially over. She loudly declared that they had found my secret digital vault hidden in the back of my father's executive desk. She proudly stated that Carter had easily cracked the drive, and discovered a master spreadsheet detailing my massive network of hidden stolen wealth. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and threw it onto the table next to the drive. It was the exact document I had created, stamped with the word "confidential" in bright red ink. She told the court reporter that this specific document contained the routing numbers for my illicit personal accounts where I had been secretly hoarding the millions I stole from my dying father. Valerie looked down at me with pure venom burning in her eyes. She boasted that her legal team was going to submit this exact list of accounts to the presiding judge first thing tomorrow morning. She promised she was going to get an immediate emergency court order to seize every single cent of my hidden millions to pay back the estate I had so greedily drained. I knew it was the perfect time to close the trap completely. I launched myself half out of my chair, reaching a desperate, trembling hand toward the printed spreadsheet resting on the table. I let out a loud, dramatic gasp and started shaking violently from head to toe. I begged Valerie to take everything else, but to please leave the final account on that list completely alone. I cried harder than before, claiming that the fourth account at the very bottom of the page was my most sacred and secret emergency fund, and that I would be ruined if she touched it. I told her I would sign the conservatorship papers right this second and surrender all my rights if she just promised not to touch or verify that specific fourth account. I acted like a cornered, terrified animal, completely panicked that my ultimate dark secret had been exposed to the world. The silence in the room was deafening as they all stared at my pathetic display of total desperation. Valerie looked down at the paper and then back up at me with dark calculation. A slow, sickeningly evil smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face as she realized just how much pain she could inflict on me. My desperate pleading had acted exactly like blood dropped into shark-infested waters. She snatched the paper back off the table and held it tightly against her chest, refusing to let me near it. She laughed a cold, cruel laugh that chilled the room and told me that she was going to make absolutely certain that her banking contacts drained that fourth account first. She promised to initiate the digital transfer the very second she left the law firm, just to watch me suffer and beg on the streets. She thought she had brilliantly discovered my ultimate financial weakness and completely outsmarted me. She was completely and utterly blinded by her own overwhelming greed and malice. She had absolutely no idea she had just eagerly agreed to trigger a classified Federal Reserve honeypot that would instantly alert the Global Cyber Terrorism Division and bring the full crushing weight of the United States government crashing down on her entire criminal network. The morning sun glared harshly off the white marble steps of the county courthouse as I walked through the heavy glass doors. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and old floor wax, a sharp contrast to the fresh morning breeze outside. I took a seat on the hard wooden bench in the hallway outside courtroom 4, clutching my simple canvas tote bag. Down the hall, the elevator doors opened, and my stepfamily made their grand entrance. Valerie wore a tailored black dress that managed to look both incredibly expensive and modestly mournful. She had perfectly applied her makeup to make her face look pale and exhausted, as if she had spent the entire night weeping for my late father. Carter and Brianna flanked her like loyal bodyguards wearing dark conservative suits that hid their usual flashy designer labels. They walked down the corridor with practiced solemnity, completely ignoring my presence on the wooden bench. Carter looked slightly twitchy, his eyes darting around the hallway, perhaps feeling the unseen pressure of his late-night digital activities, but his arrogant smirk returned the second he saw me sitting alone. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the bailiff announced that Judge Whitmore was ready to begin the morning docket. We all filed into the large, imposing room and took our respective places. I sat at the respondent's table with my hands folded quietly in my lap, staring blankly at the polished wood grain. Valerie and her legal team took over the petitioner's table, spreading out thick stacks of manila folders and legal pads. Brianna and Carter sat directly behind them in the front row of the gallery, watching the proceedings like they were attending a highly anticipated theatrical premiere. Judge Whitmore entered the room, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the massive file bearing my family name, looking down at me with an expression of deep concern. Valerie's high-priced attorney stood up and buttoned his suit jacket, clearing his throat to ensure he had the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He did not yell or act aggressively like he had during the deposition. Instead, he completely shifted his demeanor, adopting a soft, soothing tone that made my stomach churn with disgust. He addressed the judge with practiced reverence, painting a tragic and heartbreaking picture of a broken family trying to save a deeply troubled young woman. He claimed that my father's passing had completely shattered my fragile mental state, pushing me into a severe and dangerous psychological decline. He told the judge that I was suffering from extreme paranoia and delusions, making me a profound danger to myself and to the general public. He fabricated wild stories about me wandering the streets at night and suffering from severe manic episodes that required immediate medical intervention. He spoke about me as if I were a helpless child who could not even comprehend basic reality, while Valerie sat next to him dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. He insisted that I lacked the basic cognitive function to pay my own bills or care for my physical well-being. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the clicking of the stenographer's machine capturing every vicious lie being told about me. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the edge of the wooden table, forcing myself to look like a defeated shell of a human being. I knew that any sign of defiance or strength would only give their lawyer more ammunition to claim I was aggressive and uncooperative. I let my shoulders sag even further forward and wrapped my arms around my waist in a protective, defensive posture. The judge peered over her glasses at me, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the horrifying picture being painted by the defense. She took careful notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally glancing between the attorney and my silent, trembling form. She was a respected judge known for her strict adherence to the law and her deep commitment to protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation. Valerie was counting on the judge's stellar reputation to give their fraudulent conservatorship the ultimate stamp of legal legitimacy. They wanted to use the court's own integrity to permanently seal my fate. The lawyer slowly paced back and forth in front of the judge's bench, allowing his words to hang heavy in the quiet courtroom. He stated that because of my severe mental instability, I could no longer be trusted to manage my own daily affairs or make any rational choices about my future. He formally requested that the court grant Valerie immediate and total permanent conservatorship over my entire life. He did not just ask for medical decision-making power, he demanded absolute financial and physical control over every single aspect of my existence. He requested the immediate confiscation of my car keys, stating I was too unstable and reckless to operate a motor vehicle safely without endangering innocent pedestrians. He asked the judge to sign a binding legal order, officially evicting me from my modest apartment, so I could be forcibly moved into a secure, privately monitored psychiatric facility for my own safety and rehabilitation. He painted this total destruction of my personal freedom as an act of profound, selfless maternal love, claiming Valerie was willingly sacrificing her own peaceful mourning period to take on the heavy, exhausting burden of my lifelong care. I watched Valerie nod sadly along with her lawyer's devastating lies, pressing the white tissue to her cheek and letting out a soft, trembling sigh. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime portraying the weary, devoted stepmother, doing everything in her power to save her ruined stepdaughter. Carter could barely contain his arrogant energy, constantly shifting in his seat and whispering smug comments into his sister's ear. He kept adjusting his expensive silk tie, acting like he was already the master of my father's entire financial empire. He truly believed he had already drained my secret funds the night before, and was now just waiting for the legal system to officially hand over the rest of my modest life. Brianna let out a loud, dramatic sigh every time the lawyer mentioned my supposed mental struggles, rolling her eyes to show the court just how exhausting it was to deal with my pathetic existence. They were so incredibly confident in their impending victory that they did not even bother to hide their contempt for the legal process taking place around them. The attorney paused and returned to his polished table, picking up a single sheet of paper stamped with bright red ink. He turned back to face the judge, holding the document up high in the air, like it was the ultimate, undeniable piece of criminal evidence. He lowered his voice into a grave, serious whisper and told Judge Whitmore that they had recently uncovered a shocking and deeply disturbing development regarding my personal finances. He stated that they had found a hidden digital drive, proving I had been secretly hoarding massive amounts of stolen wealth in undisclosed offshore accounts while pretending to live a simple life. He walked solemnly up to the high wooden bench and handed the printed spreadsheet directly to the judge, ensuring she saw the confidential stamp at the top. It was the exact list I had meticulously planted, containing the 3 real modest accounts and the massive federal honeypot routing number sitting right at the very bottom. He demanded that the court issue an immediate emergency injunction to permanently freeze those 4 specific bank accounts and transfer absolute control of the funds directly to Valerie before I could recklessly squander the stolen money. He pointed a long, accusing finger directly at the 4th account on the list, telling the judge it contained tens of millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to my father's estate and desperately needed to be secured that very second by court order. Judge Whitmore reached down from her elevated wooden bench and took the printed spreadsheet from the aggressively confident lawyer. Her face was a mask of careful judicial neutrality as her eyes scanned the bright red ink. I kept my head pointed firmly at the floor. I made sure to let my shoulders tremble visibly so the entire opposing legal team could witness my absolute terror. I slowly shifted my weight and let my eyes dart up just enough to see the gallery directly behind the defense table. Carter was practically vibrating with manic excitement in his heavy wooden chair. He was grinning so widely his face looked like it might split in half. He was undoubtedly thinking about the massive illicit wire transfers he had frantically attempted to authorize the night before from his laptop. He truly believed he had successfully bypassed the security on my secret $50 million trust and diverted the funds directly to his dangerous cartel creditors. He was sitting in a court of law watching the legal system wrap a neat little protective bow around his monumental federal crime. Next to him, Brianna was completely ignoring the gravity of the legal proceedings. She had actually pulled a crystal emery board out of her oversized designer handbag and was lazily filing her perfectly manicured nails. She blew the fine dust off her fingertips with a loud puff of air. It was a display of absolute blatant disrespect for the judge, for the legal process, and for my entire existence. She looked incredibly bored, simply waiting for the tedious legal formalities to conclude so they could finally leave and start spending my supposed secret fortune. I stood entirely alone at the respondents' table, feeling the cold, smooth wood under my trembling fingers. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and erratic, playing the part of the completely destroyed victim who had just been caught in a massive, undeniable lie. Valerie watched me from across the aisle with cold, cruel satisfaction. She genuinely believed she had backed me into an inescapable corner and stripped away my last remaining defense. She thought this single piece of paper was the ultimate weapon that would permanently steal away my freedom and hand her complete control over my father's entire legacy. But beneath my pathetic, shivering exterior, my heart was beating with a fierce and steady rhythm. I knew exactly what was happening outside the thick walls of this quiet courthouse. I knew that the exact moment Carter had typed that routing number into his computer the night before, he had essentially signed his own federal arrest warrant. I just needed to stand here and play the helpless victim a little bit longer. I needed to let them dig their graves a little bit deeper on the official court record. I needed the judge to formally recognize the exact nature of the trap they had so willingly and greedily swallowed. Judge Whitmore adjusted her silver reading glasses and stared down at the confidential stamp on the printed spreadsheet. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. She looked over the top of her glasses and asked the aggressive lawyer if this was the complete and final list of financial assets he wished to submit as formal evidence for the emergency injunction. The lawyer puffed out his chest and proudly confirmed it was the definitive list. He demanded once again that the funds be immediately seized by the court and placed under Valerie direct permanent control to prevent me from hiding the money offshore. The judge nodded slowly, her expression completely unreadable, and handed the piece of paper down to the court clerk, sitting at the lower desk directly in front of her raised bench. She instructed the clerk to read the listed assets aloud, so they could be permanently entered into the official public record before she made any sweeping legal decisions regarding the conservatorship petition. The clerk was an older man with a tired, weary expression and a flat, monotone voice. He picked up the paper and adjusted the thin black microphone on his desk, clearing his throat in the dead silence of the courtroom. Valerie leaned forward in her heavy leather chair, resting her chin on her clasped hands, completely eager to hear the sweet sound of my financial ruin spoken out loud on the record. The clerk began reading slowly from the top of the spreadsheet. He listed the name of my first modest local savings account and recited the small, unremarkable balance. He moved on to the second account, and then the third account, carefully reading off the standard domestic routing numbers and the meager amounts of money I had saved from my quiet computer repair business. Valerie's lawyer let out a loud, dramatic sigh, shaking his head slowly, to show the judge just how pathetic and insignificant those first three accounts were, compared to the massive theft he was alleging. Carter actually snickered from the gallery, loudly whispering to Brianna that my entire life savings would not even cover the cost of the custom leather seats in his new luxury sports car. Brianna smirked and went back to filing her nails, completely unimpressed by my actual reality. They were so incredibly eager to get to the final line of the document. They wanted the entire courtroom to hear the massive $50 million balance so they could brand me as a master thief. They were practically salivating at the thought of claiming that phantom money as their own personal reward for enduring my presence in their lives. The tired clerk finally reached the very bottom of the page. He paused for a fraction of a second, staring down at the incredibly complex string of digits listed for the fourth and final account. He leaned closer to his microphone and began reading the long, strange international routing number aloud. His flat, monotone voice filled the quiet courtroom with the exact sequence of the classified federal honeypot. He read every single digit slowly and clearly, ensuring the court reporter captured the massive phantom account for the permanent public record. As the specific, unique combination of numbers echoed off the high wooden walls, I slowly lifted my head and watched Judge Whitmore's face. The physical transformation was absolute and immediate. The mild judicial concern she had shown moments before completely vanished from her features, replaced by a look of sheer stunned comprehension. Because of her high-level position, she held a strict federal security clearance. She recognized the highly classified numeric prefix the very second it left the clerk's mouth. It was the undeniable digital signature of a Federal Reserve Cyberterrorism Division phantom account specifically designed to catch global cartels. Judge Whitmore slowly lowered her silver glasses and stared directly at Valerie and Carter, realizing instantly that the arrogant people demanding control of this money were not concerned family members, but massive criminals who had just proudly presented evidence of their own federal treason. Judge Whitmore flinched so violently that her heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the polished wooden floor, echoing sharply in the tense quiet of the courtroom. Her eyes went wide with absolute, unadulterated horror as the sheer magnitude of the routing number washed over her judicial composure, completely shattering in an instant. She snatched her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a violent cracking strike that sounded like a gunshot through the silent room. She banged the heavy gavel 3 more times, demanding that the court clerk stop reading the document immediately and ordering the stenographer to secure the official transcript. She stood up behind the massive wooden bench, her silver hair trembling slightly, and shouted for all media personnel and unauthorized civilians to exit the courtroom right this second. She pointed a shaking finger at the stunned bailiff and ordered him to lock the heavy oak doors and call for immediate high-level security backup from the federal marshals stationed downstairs. The sudden explosion of judicial panic sent a massive shockwave through the gallery as people scrambled over each other, trying to understand what terrible event was happening. Valerie completely misread the sudden chaotic shift in the room and the absolute terror radiating from the bench. She remained standing at the petitioner's table, completely blinded by her own massive ego and toxic arrogance, assuming this was all a reaction to my supposed guilt. She genuinely believed that the experienced judge was simply reeling from the sheer financial scale of my massive supposed deception. A sickeningly sweet smile of absolute triumph spread across Valerie's perfectly powdered face as she looked over at me with pure, venomous hatred. She smoothed the front of her expensive black designer dress and leaned confidently toward the high wooden bench, acting like a conquering queen. She told the judge that she completely understood the court's absolute shock at seeing such a massive illicit fortune hiding in plain sight within a respected family. She pointed a long manicured finger directly at my face and loudly declared that I was a deceitful, dangerous criminal who needed to be locked away in a secure psychiatric facility for the safety of the general public. She pushed the thick stack of emergency injunction papers across the polished mahogany table and demanded that the judge sign the immediate transfer order right now to secure the stolen funds under her rightful control before I could hide them again. Judge Whitmore did not reach for the papers, and she did not offer any words of comfort to the grieving stepmother. She slowly removed her silver reading glasses and let them drop onto the desk with a sharp clatter that cut through the remaining murmurs in the room. She stared down at Valerie with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, mixed with absolute disgust and sheer disbelief. The judge leaned forward over the heavy wooden barrier, and her voice dropped into a terrifyingly quiet register that commanded the absolute breathless attention of every single person left in the room. She asked Valerie if she had even the slightest comprehension of what she had just submitted into the official public record of a United States court. She asked the smug woman if she had any idea whose specific financial account she had just eagerly attempted to steal using forged legal documents and perjured testimony. The courtroom fell so incredibly quiet that the low hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. The judge stated clearly and firmly for the official court record that the specific routing number on that printed spreadsheet did not belong to a hidden offshore family trust or a secret personal vault. She explained with absolute grave certainty that the unique numeric prefix officially designated the account as a highly classified Tier 1 Federal Reserve honeypot, explicitly monitored and controlled by the United States government. Valerie's triumphant smile instantly froze on her face and then melted away into a mask of pure white terror as the crushing reality of those impossible words finally penetrated her thick, arrogant skull. She took a stumbling, clumsy step backward away from the defense table, gasping for air like a fish thrown violently onto dry land, her hands flying up to cover her open mouth. Carter violently pushed his heavy wooden chair back and scrambled frantically for his expensive encrypted smartphone, his previous smug demeanor completely evaporating. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the slick metal device onto the hard floor as he desperately tried to open his secure applications. He needed to log into his cartel routing network, hoping to sever the digital connection he had arrogantly established the night before when he thought he was stealing my money. But the dark screen of his phone instantly flashed with a bright red federal seizure notice, confirming that every single offshore account connected to his criminal network had been permanently frozen and locked by the government. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that his late-night hacking attempt had not been a brilliant theft, but a direct and undeniable confession of international cybercrime. Before Valerie or Carter could even attempt to form a coherent defense or beg for mercy, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with explosive force. A massive tactical team of federal agents wearing dark suits and heavy tactical gear flooded into the room, completely taking over the space in a matter of seconds. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out across the gallery, blocking every possible exit and securing the perimeter before anyone could even take a single breath. Brianna dropped her crystal nail file, letting it shatter into tiny, sparkling pieces on the hard floor as two heavily armed agents took up imposing positions directly behind her chair. She let out a pathetic whimpering sound, completely paralyzed by the sudden overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement surrounding her perfect little world. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, marched straight down the center aisle, holding a thick leather folder and a golden badge that glinted brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. He bypassed the defense table entirely, not even granting Valerie a single glance, and walked directly toward where I was sitting alone at the respondents' table. I knew the elaborate, exhausting stage play was finally over, and I could finally drop the heavy burden of my false identity. I stopped my pathetic shivering and let the fake tears dry completely on my cheeks as a wave of pure adrenaline rushed through my veins. I took a deep, steadying breath and slowly stood up from the respondents' table, completely shedding the suffocating persona of the terrified, broken stepdaughter they thought they had conquered. I rolled my shoulders back to release the tension and lifted my head high, looking directly into Valerie's horrified, staring eyes with a look of absolute cold authority. The lead federal agent stopped at the edge of my table and gave me a crisp, professional nod, acknowledging my successful undercover operation and the flawless execution of our long-term plan. He turned his broad back to me to face the stunned judge and formally announced that the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division was officially taking physical custody of the entire defense team for premeditated cyber terrorism, extortion, and international financial fraud. I stood perfectly still, holding my head high, and watched the absolute total destruction of my toxic family, knowing that they had willingly walked into the very cage they had so eagerly built for me. Valerie stared wildly at the lead federal agent, completely refusing to accept the catastrophic reality unfolding right in front of her perfectly powdered face. She gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table and stammered that there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding, claiming that I was just a sick, delusional girl who had somehow stolen her husband's legitimate wealth. I looked at her, desperately clinging to her crumbling lies, and I knew it was finally time to completely drop the act. The last remaining trace of my timid, frightened persona evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but cold, hard truth. I finally stood up perfectly straight, letting my spine lock into a rigid military posture that I had trained years to perfect. I pulled my shoulders back and let my physical demeanor completely shift from a terrified, defenseless victim to a lethal, highly trained federal operative. I took a deep, steadying breath and let my eyes turn as cold and hard as steel, completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. I reached deep into the inside breast pocket of my conservative black blazer and wrapped my fingers securely around the heavy, cold metal of my official credentials. I stepped out from behind the respondents' table, moving with deliberate, predatory grace until I was standing directly in front of the stunned defense team. I raised my arm and brought my hand down hard, slapping my solid gold federal badge directly onto the polished table right next to their pathetic forged documents. The heavy metal badge gleamed brightly under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lights, bearing the unmistakable imposing seal of the United States government. I looked directly into Valerie's terrified, shaking face and delivered the exact words that would permanently end her life of luxury and deceit. I told her in a loud, clear voice that I am a lead cyber investigator for the U.S. Treasury. I watched the color completely drain from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost, as the absolute certainty of my true identity crashed down upon her. I pointed a steady finger at the printed spreadsheet she had so proudly submitted to the judge just moments before. I explained that the massive fourth account listed on that paper did not belong to my dead father or any hidden family trust, but belongs entirely and exclusively to the federal government. I leaned in closer, resting my hands on the table, and told her that by using a forged signature to claim it, and by instructing Carter to attempt to wire funds from it last night, they did not just commit simple perjury. I made sure my voice echoed clearly through the dead silence of the courtroom as I declared that they committed federal cyber terrorism, wire fraud, and absolute treason. Carter looked like he was going to physically throw up right there in the middle of the crowded courtroom. His usual arrogant swagger and toxic confidence had been entirely erased, replaced by the trembling, pathetic reality of a young man suddenly facing the rest of his life in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He started babbling incoherently, throwing his shaking hands up in the air and desperately pointing at his mother, crying out to the agents that it was all her idea. He practically begged the stoic officers to believe that he only hacked the routing number because his mother had aggressively forced him to do it. Brianna was practically hyperventilating in the front row of the gallery, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as hot, panicked tears spilled from her eyes. She tried to stand up and quietly back away toward the center aisle, hoping she could somehow sneak out of the room and pretend she had absolutely nothing to do with her mother and brother. She quickly realized she was completely and hopelessly trapped as the tall federal agents tightened their defensive perimeter, forming an impenetrable wall of dark tactical gear around the entire family. Valerie slowly shook her head violently back and forth, completely refusing to accept the total destruction of her carefully masterminded plot. She looked frantically up at the high wooden bench, begging Judge Whitmore to stop this madness and claiming loudly that I was somehow fabricating this entire federal operation. Judge Whitmore simply stared down at her with absolute unwavering disgust and formally stated on the official public record that the federal agents possessed full jurisdiction and absolute legal authority over her courtroom. Valerie reached a trembling hand toward the shiny gold badge resting on the table, as if desperately trying to verify that the heavy metal shield was actually real before a federal agent stepped forward and physically blocked her reach. She finally realized in that devastating moment that the frail, weak stepdaughter she had spent years torturing and mocking was entirely a carefully constructed, deliberate illusion. She realized that my simple, quiet life fixing computers was a highly sanctioned federal cover story designed specifically to monitor international money laundering through local businesses. She understood with absolute horrifying clarity that she had willingly walked directly into a massive federal trap and proudly handed the government the exact concrete evidence they needed to destroy her criminal associates forever. I explained to the completely silent room that the Treasury Department had been tracking her underground financial movements for over 3 years, building an airtight case against her network. I told her that we knew she was manipulating my father's failing health and using his legitimate corporate accounts to launder illicit funds for violent overseas syndicates. I stated clearly for the record that my father had secretly come to me when he first suspected her financial crimes, and that we had worked together tirelessly to isolate his true wealth safely out of her greedy reach. I explained that the $50 million honeypot was the ultimate digital bait designed to prove her direct connection to the global cartel network by letting her attempt to steal it. By officially claiming that phantom money in a court of law using forged documents, she had legally bound herself to a massive international terror syndicate. The federal government now possessed the absolute legal authority to seize every single asset she owned, including the expensive cars, the massive houses, the luxury jewelry, and every last cent she had wrongfully stolen from my father. The high-priced defense attorney was frantically shoving his scattered papers into his expensive leather briefcase, desperately trying to distance himself from his suddenly toxic clients. He raised his hands high in the air and loudly declared to the federal agents and the judge that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of the forged documents or the attempted midnight wire fraud. He officially withdrew as their legal counsel right there on the spot, leaving Valerie completely undefended and entirely alone to face the wrath of the United States government. Valerie let out a loud, piercing shriek of pure frustration and devastating anger, grabbing the edge of the heavy wooden table as her knees finally gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard, polished floor, weeping hysterically as the absolute certainty of a lifelong prison sentence crashed down upon her shoulders. I stood over her, feeling absolutely no pity or remorse for the cruel woman who had gleefully tried to destroy my life and steal my family legacy. The lead federal agent placed his hand on his communication earpiece, nodding sharply as he received an urgent tactical update from the perimeter team stationed in the hallway. The tense atmosphere in the room shifted from stunned silence to sudden explosive action as a loud, heavy impact echoed from the back of the chamber. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom were violently kicked open, swinging wide on their brass hinges and slamming hard against the interior walls. A dozen heavily armed FBI agents stormed into the room, wearing full dark tactical gear and carrying heavy automatic weapons, moving to secure the building completely. The sheer physical force of the federal agents flooding the courtroom completely shattered whatever tiny, fragile fragments of reality Valerie and Carter were still desperately clinging to. Heavy combat boots pounded against the polished wooden floor as the tactical team aggressively formed an impenetrable perimeter, securing every single window and door while shouting strict, clear commands that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The lead agent forcefully ordered everyone to keep their hands entirely visible and to step away from the heavy mahogany tables. The thick, suffocating atmosphere of aristocratic privilege and legal manipulation that Valerie had so carefully cultivated for years was instantly obliterated by the harsh, undeniable reality of federal law enforcement. I watched with immense cold satisfaction as the agents aggressively swarmed the petitioner's table, completely ignoring the panicked whimpering of the highly paid legal assistants who were frantically trying to gather their expensive briefcases and flee the room. The absolute complete destruction of their toxic little family unit happened in a matter of seconds. The second a large, muscular FBI agent grabbed Carter's expensive tailored suit jacket and forcefully spun him around to face the wall. The cowardly illusion of their united front entirely evaporated. Carter did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second before he completely turned on his own mother. He began thrashing wildly against the agents, strong grip pointing a frantic, shaking finger directly at Valerie's horrified face. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic terror, swearing to the federal officers that he was innocent and that his mother had aggressively forced him to do everything. He blubbered hysterically, claiming that Valerie was the true criminal mastermind who had meticulously orchestrated the entire financial fraud and that she had ruthlessly manipulated his technical skills to steal my father's wealth. He eagerly threw the woman who had coddled and spoiled him his entire life directly under the bus, desperate to save his own pathetic skin from a lengthy federal prison sentence. Valerie let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure demonic fury as she listened to her golden boy betray her so completely and publicly. She scrambled up from the floor where she had collapsed earlier, her face twisted into a hideous mask of unadulterated rage and absolute panic. She pointed right back at her son and shrieked to the judge and the surrounding agents that Carter was a dangerous pathological liar and a massive cybercriminal. She completely abandoned any pretense of maternal love, aggressively declaring that Carter was the one deeply in debt to violent international drug cartels, and that he had orchestrated the entire digital theft to save his own miserable life. She hysterically accused him of hacking the Federal Reserve on his own arrogant initiative, screaming that she was just a grieving widow who had been horribly deceived by her own sociopathic offspring. They stood there in the middle of the heavily guarded courtroom, viciously tearing each other to absolute shreds, each desperately trying to shovel all the federal guilt onto the other, exposing the deep, rotten core of their incredibly toxic relationship for the entire world to witness. While the mother and son engaged in their loud, pathetic display of mutual betrayal, Brianna finally seemed to grasp the devastating reality of her completely ruined future. She stood frozen by the gallery benches, her expensive designer handbag slipping from her manicured fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The glamorous, sophisticated facade she had so carefully maintained her entire adult life violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She stared at her husband, watching him cry and beg and violently betray his own mother, and the sickening truth finally registered in her shallow mind. Carter was not a brilliant, wealthy tech investor or a master of international finance. He was a broke, desperate fraud who had heavily leveraged their entire fake, luxurious lifestyle on stolen money and massive, dangerous cartel debts. Real, genuine tears finally burst from Brianna's eyes, streaming down her face and completely ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. She was not crying for her husband or for the serious federal charges they were all facing. She was crying for the luxury cars, the massive mansions, the exclusive country club memberships, and the endless shopping sprees that had just evaporated into thin air. She realized with absolute crushing despair that her life of effortless privilege was entirely over and she would be leaving this courtroom with absolutely nothing. Two heavily armed agents moved in and forcefully pushed Carter against the smooth oak paneling of the courtroom wall, aggressively pulling his arms behind his back to secure the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He was crying so hard that he could barely breathe, his chest heaving with massive, pathetic sobs as the cold metal locked into place. I slowly stepped away from the respondents' table, leaving the protection of the lead agent, and walked deliberately across the room toward my incredibly arrogant stepbrother. My footsteps echoed softly against the wood floor, and my expression remained completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. I approached him with the slow, calculated grace of a predator who had finally cornered its absolute favorite prey. The agent saw my federal badge shining brightly on my lapel and silently stepped back just enough to give me a few moments of completely unrestricted access to the prisoner. Carter turned his head and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, his face completely wet with tears and sweat. He tried to stammer out another pathetic excuse, a desperate plea for me to somehow use my federal authority to help him, but I did not let him speak. I leaned in extremely close, completely invading his personal space, until my face was only inches from his trembling ear. I kept my voice low and dangerously quiet, making absolutely sure that only he could hear the devastating words that would permanently seal his absolute psychological destruction. I told him in a soft, steady whisper that our federal cyber division had actively monitored his entire network the previous night and that we had successfully intercepted his frantic digital wire transfer to the cartel. I paused for just a fraction of a second, letting the sheer weight of that specific information hang heavily in the air between us, before delivering the final lethal blow. I whispered that the cartel now knew exactly who he was. They knew he had completely failed to deliver their money, and they knew he had foolishly exposed their routing numbers to the United States government. I slowly pulled back and watched the absolute total annihilation of Carter's mind. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of chalky white. His eyes rolled wildly in his head, and his knees visibly buckled completely, giving out beneath him. The two federal agents had to physically haul him back up by his armpits to keep him from collapsing into a pathetic heap on the floor. The sheer, unadulterated terror of federal prison was instantly eclipsed by the much darker, more violent reality of an international cartel discovering his massive betrayal. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the government might lock him in a cell, but the cartel would hunt him down and destroy him completely. He began thrashing weakly against the agents, his voice rising into a high-pitched, hysterical scream of absolute panic. He begged the federal officers with everything he had, pleading for immediate protective custody, demanding to be placed in solitary confinement, and screaming that they could not leave him out in the open. He was willingly, desperately begging the federal agents to lock him away in the deepest, darkest hole they could possibly find, completely terrified of the brutal, lethal consequences he had so arrogantly brought upon himself. I stood perfectly still, watching him lose his mind entirely, feeling the warm, satisfying glow of absolute justice as the agents finally dragged him forcefully out of the chaotic courtroom. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind the federal agents as they dragged Carter's thrashing, sobbing body out into the long marble hallway, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in their wake. Judge Whitmore remained standing behind her elevated mahogany bench, her face completely devoid of any previous sympathy or judicial patience she had once shown the grieving widow. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down one single time with a deafening crack that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, demanding absolute total order in her courtroom. The remaining federal agents stood like statues around the perimeter, their hands resting casually on their tactical belts, completely surrounding the petitioner's table, where Valerie stood trembling violently. The arrogant, sophisticated facade that Valerie had worn like expensive armor for the past decade was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic, shivering reality of a trapped, cornered animal. She looked up at the judge with wide, terrified eyes, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, or perhaps to try and spin one final ridiculous lie, but Judge Whitmore raised a single stern hand, cutting her off instantly. The judge looked down at the emergency conservatorship petition, the very document Valerie had so eagerly signed just hours ago, hoping to steal my entire life and legally enslave me. Judge Whitmore picked up the fraudulent document between her thumb and forefinger, holding it up like it was a piece of filthy trash, before letting it drop back onto the desk. She leaned forward toward the microphone, and her voice rang out with absolute terrifying authority, stating clearly, for the official public record, that the emergency petition for conservatorship was officially and permanently denied. Valerie let out a tiny, pathetic gasp as the judge continued speaking her words, slicing through the quiet room like a razor-sharp scalpel. Judge Whitmore explained that by willingly bringing fraudulent documents into a United States court and attempting to use the legal system to authorize an illegal wire transfer to a classified federal honeypot, Valerie had crossed a massive, unforgivable line. The judge declared that this was no longer a simple family dispute or a civil matter of inheritance, but a direct, coordinated attack on the financial security of the United States government. She explicitly invoked the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, completely reclassifying Valerie's entire luxurious existence as a massive, continuing criminal enterprise. Valerie's knees visibly buckled as the terrifying acronym RICO echoed through the courtroom, finally making her understand the absolute catastrophic magnitude of her epic failure. The judge did not stop there. She reached for a blank emergency order form and pulled her heavy silver pen from its holder, pressing the tip firmly against the thick paper. She stated that under the immediate authority granted to her by federal RICO statutes, she was issuing an emergency freeze and total physical seizure of every single asset tied to Valerie's name. The judge systematically listed the immediate confiscation of the massive primary estate in the prestigious gated community, the luxurious summer mansion on the coast, and the entire fleet of expensive imported vehicles parked in their massive garages. She ordered the immediate freezing of Carter's fraudulent technology business, completely liquidating its imaginary assets to pay for the massive federal investigation. She commanded the banks to instantly lock every single personal offshore and corporate account linked to the family, effectively stripping Valerie of every last cent she had ever stolen, hoarded, or married into. Valerie stood there paralyzed, listening to the judge systematically erase her entire wealthy identity in less than 3 minutes, leaving her absolutely, completely destitute. She had walked into this courtroom wearing diamond earrings and a custom black designer dress, planning to steal $50 million from her helpless stepdaughter, and she was going to leave this building in handcuffs with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. 2 tall, heavily built federal agents stepped out from the perimeter and walked slowly toward the petitioner's table, pulling thick metal handcuffs from their tactical belts. Valerie finally snapped completely, losing her mind as the cold, harsh reality of her new destitute, imprisoned life crashed down upon her shoulders. She began screaming hysterically, throwing her arms wildly in the air and trying to back away from the advancing agents, her expensive high heels slipping clumsily on the polished wooden floor. She shrieked that she was a respected member of high society, that she sat on prestigious charity boards, and that they absolutely could not treat her like a common street criminal. The agents completely ignored her pathetic, desperate rants, expertly grabbing her flailing arms and forcefully twisting them behind her back. She fought against them with the wild, unpredictable strength of absolute panic, her perfect hair falling into her face and her expensive dress tearing slightly at the seam. The cold, heavy steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, locking her into her new, inescapable reality. The satisfying metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room, signaling the absolute permanent end of her reign of terror over my life. As the agents began to physically pull her toward the heavy oak doors, Valerie's wild, panicked eyes frantically searched the room until they finally locked directly onto me. I was standing perfectly still, leaning slightly against the respondent's table, completely relaxed, and watching her ultimate destruction with cold, unfeeling satisfaction. She stopped struggling against the agents and suddenly changed her tactics completely, pivoting from a screaming maniac into a weeping, desperate mother figure. Tears poured down her ruined face as she looked at me, pleading with pathetic manufactured emotion, begging me to tell the agents to stop this madness. She cried out that we were family, that she had raised me in her own home, and that she loved me like her very own daughter, hoping I would somehow show her the mercy she had never once shown me. I slowly walked across the open space between the tables, stopping just a few feet away from where she was being firmly held by the federal agents. I looked deeply into her pathetic, terrified eyes, entirely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness, and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I tilted my head slightly and told her in a perfectly calm, even voice that I was just protecting her assets from her financial incompetence. Stepmother exactly what she wanted. One entire week had passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom slammed shut on Valerie's luxurious life of absolute crime. The sweeping federal RICO seizure had been absolute and devastatingly thorough-moving, with a terrifying speed that left the entire criminal syndicate completely paralyzed. Every single bank account tied to the family name had been permanently frozen and drained into secure federal holding trusts. The massive, sprawling mansions were now completely surrounded by yellow caution tape, and federal agents meticulously cataloging every stolen piece of designer furniture and expensive jewelry. Carter's fake technology business had been entirely liquidated. Its servers seized by the government to dismantle the dangerous cartel network he had so arrogantly tried to join. I walked out of the towering glass and steel federal building in downtown Washington, feeling the warm, bright afternoon sun on my face. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was not looking over my shoulder or pretending to be a frightened little girl hiding from a cruel, vindictive stepmother. I was finally wearing my dark tailored federal suit, my heavy gold badge clipped securely to my belt, and carrying a thick file of successfully closed case documents. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm, knowing that the dangerous people who had murdered my father and stolen his legacy were finally locked away in small concrete cells where they belonged. As I approached the wide, sweeping concrete steps leading down to the busy metropolitan street, I noticed a pathetic, trembling figure sitting on the low stone wall. It took me a full 10 seconds to even recognize the woman huddled there, shivering slightly in the warm summer breeze. It was Brianna, the glamorous, arrogant woman who had sat in the courtroom lazily filing her perfect nails while eagerly anticipating my complete destruction, was entirely gone. Her expensive blonde hair was heavily tangled and greasy, pulled back into a messy, uneven knot at the base of her neck. She was wearing a pair of cheap stained gray sweatpants and a faded, oversized t-shirt that looked like it had been pulled directly from a charity donation bin. Her bare feet were shoved into scuffed plastic sandals, and she looked completely exhausted, her bloodshot eyes darting nervously at every passing security guard. She had clearly been waiting outside the federal building for hours, desperately hoping to catch me on my way out to my vehicle. She scrambled frantically to her feet the second she saw me descending the wide concrete steps, her face instantly contorting into a mask of absolute desperate panic. She ran toward me, throwing her shaking hands out as if she wanted to grab my dark blazer, but stopping short when she saw the cold, lethal warning in my eyes. She started talking so fast that the words stumbled over each other in a pathetic, jumbled mess of wet tears and heavy excuses. She cried out that the government had taken absolutely everything from her and that she had been locked out of her own home with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on her back. She blubbered loudly that Carter was gone, locked away in some high-security federal holding facility, and refusing to speak to her while his mother Valerie was completely isolated in federal custody, facing life in prison. She sobbed that all her rich, shallow friends had instantly blocked her number the very second the news of the massive federal raid hit the local media, leaving her totally alone and destitute on the unforgiving streets. Brianna wiped her running nose on the dirty sleeve of her cheap shirt and took a tentative, shaking step closer, trying to look like a harmless, helpless victim of circumstance. She looked up at me with wide, watery eyes and desperately tried to play the absolute last card she thought might still work on me. She whimpered softly that we were family and that we were supposed to be sisters who took care of each other when things got impossibly hard. She begged me for a warm place to stay, just for a few short weeks, claiming she knew I had a beautiful, safe apartment and plenty of federal money now that the long nightmare was finally over. She promised she would be completely quiet and stay entirely out of my way if I just showed her a tiny shred of mercy and gave her a soft bed to sleep in. She actually had the sheer, sickening audacity to suggest that we could finally bond and be the real loving sisters we were always meant to be now that Valerie and Carter were out of the picture forever. I stood perfectly still on the hard concrete steps, listening to her pathetic, desperate lies, and feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow disgust for the broken woman standing in front of me. I did not yell at her, and I did not bother reminding her of the years of cruel jokes and vicious mocking she had eagerly participated in when she thought I was just a worthless piece of garbage. I simply reached into the deep inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp, clean white envelope. Brianna's dirty, tear-stained face instantly lit up with a sickeningly familiar gleam of pure, greedy hope. Her eyes locked hungrily onto the thick white paper, assuming it was exactly what she had come here to beg for. She let out a wet, relieved laugh, reaching her trembling hands out to take the envelope from my fingers, genuinely believing I was handing her a thick stack of federal cash to go start a new, comfortable life of leisure. She clutched the envelope tightly to her chest, thanking me profusely and praising my generous, forgiving heart completely blind to the harsh, cold reality of the situation unfolding around her. I stood there in silence and watched her eagerly rip open the flap of the envelope, her dirty fingers shaking with massive anticipation as she pulled out the folded papers hidden inside. The greedy, hopeful smile on her face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, absolute horror and confusion as she stared down at the black and white text. It was not a federal check, or a thick stack of $100 bills, or a shiny key to a luxury apartment downtown. It was a standard double-sided application form for a minimum wage retail job at a local discount grocery store. I had specifically printed it out from the agency break room earlier that morning, knowing exactly what kind of desperate, entitled leeches would try to crawl back into my life once the dust finally settled on the raid. Brianna stared at the cheap, rough paper as if it were covered in toxic, burning poison, her mouth opening and closing rapidly without any sound coming out. She looked up at me completely horrified, unable to comprehend that her days of effortless luxury and cruel privilege were permanently over and that she was literally holding the only real future she had left in her hands. I looked her dead in the eyes, letting all the cold professional authority of my high-level federal position wash over her completely broken spirit. I told her in a flat, emotionless voice that it was finally time for her to learn exactly how the real world actually works. I did not wait for her to respond or stick around to watch her inevitably burst into a fresh, pathetic wave of hysterical, devastated tears. I simply stepped around her trembling form and walked down the few remaining concrete steps toward the busy street corner. A heavy black government SUV with thick tinted windows smoothly pulled up to the curb right in front of me, the armed driver immediately stepping out to open the heavy armored door. I climbed into the comfortable dark leather seat, and the driver closed the door with a solid, heavy thud, completely shutting out the pathetic sound of Brianna's endless weeping. The dark, imposing vehicle merged seamlessly into the busy afternoon city traffic, carrying me far away from the pathetic wreckage of my fake family and leaving Brianna standing completely alone on the harsh concrete sidewalk, clutching her minimum wage reality. The heavy black government SUV navigated the winding roads, leaving the chaotic blaring noise of the city far behind me as we headed toward the peaceful green hills of the Memorial Park. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the tall, ancient oak trees, casting long, gentle shadows across the perfectly manicured grass and the neat rows of polished stone. I asked the driver to wait by the wrought iron gates, and I walked the rest of the long way alone, carrying a simple, beautiful bouquet of white lilies. The air was incredibly crisp and quiet, a stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming and crying and frantic begging that had defined the past few weeks of my life. I finally reached the top of the gentle slope where my father's grave looked out over the sweeping valley below. I stood there in the quiet stillness, feeling the cool breeze against my face and taking a deep, long, steadying breath. It felt like I had been holding that breath for years, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to finally let it out. I knelt down carefully, smoothing my tailored trousers, and gently laid the fresh white lilies against the smooth gray stone. I traced the engraved letters of his name, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my entire spirit. I spoke to him quietly, my voice carrying softly on the gentle wind, telling him that the long nightmare was finally over, and that the horrible, greedy people who had poisoned his final years were completely destroyed. I told him that I had kept my promise to protect his true legacy from the violent parasites who had swarmed his life and tried to tear our family apart. There were no sad tears left in my eyes, only a deep, abiding peace that anchored my soul to the earth. For so long I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of playing the weak, defenseless scapegoat, constantly swallowing my pride to maintain my highly classified federal cover, while watching Valerie and Carter gleefully desecrate everything my father had built. Kneeling there on the soft grass, I told my father that the agonizing wait and the daily humiliations were worth every single miserable second. I felt a warm, comforting presence surround me, as if he was standing right there beside me, placing a proud, loving hand on my shoulder. I knew he would have been incredibly proud of the woman I had become. A woman who did not just inherit massive power, but wielded it with absolute surgical precision to eradicate the corruption that had tried to consume our family. I lingered by the grave and thought about exactly where Valerie and Carter were at this very moment, sitting in separate, sterile concrete cells in a maximum security federal holding facility, awaiting their massive criminal trials. Under the crushing absolute weight of the RICO Act, the federal government had systematically dismantled every single aspect of their fraudulent imaginary existence. The luxury cars had been quickly auctioned off, the sprawling mansions were seized and completely emptied out, and their offshore accounts were permanently frozen, turning them into penniless inmates. Valerie was currently facing decades behind bars for orchestrating an international money laundering syndicate and masterminding massive financial fraud. Her endless daily complaints about the horrible, bland prison food and the scratchy orange uniforms were entirely ignored by the stoic guards, who treated her exactly like the common, pathetic criminal she truly was. Carter had completely folded under the terrifying pressure, constantly crying during his daily interrogations and desperately trying to trade non-existent cyber secrets for a lighter sentence. He was entirely paralyzed by the constant looming threat of the cartel, realizing that even an isolated federal prison might not be safe enough to protect him from the violent people he had arrogantly tried to cheat. They had absolutely nothing left, completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their arrogant pride, and their toxic freedom. While they rotted in their miserable, damp cells awaiting federal justice, I had meticulously worked with the Treasury Department and top forensic accountants to fully untangle my father's legitimate wealth from Valerie's dirty laundered cartel funds. It took weeks of relentless, brilliant accounting, but we successfully isolated every clean, honest dollar that my father had earned through decades of hard, honest work. I refused to keep a single penny of it for myself, knowing that my senior federal salary and my own deep personal investments were more than enough to sustain my quiet, luxurious life. Instead, I completely redirected my father's restored millions into a massive private charity fund dedicated to providing advanced cybersecurity training and full educational scholarships for brilliant underprivileged youth. I named the foundation after him, ensuring that his legacy would forever be associated with helping young minds build secure futures rather than the toxic greed of his second wife. The massive fortune that Valerie had schemed and plotted and committed absolute treason to steal was now entirely out of her greedy reach, funding the exact kind of brilliant technical minds that would one day hunt down greedy criminals just like her. I stood up from the grave, brushing a stray blade of grass from my knee, and said a final quiet goodbye to my father, knowing his spirit was finally at absolute rest. 1 month later, I was sitting comfortably behind the massive polished glass desk in my high-tech corner office at the Federal Cyber Command Center in Washington, D.C. The room was impeccably designed, reflecting my true status and undeniable authority, with multiple glowing monitors displaying real-time international financial data streams across the dark walls. I was dressed in a sharp, flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute power and quiet wealth. My hair perfectly styled, and my posture entirely relaxed. The miserable, timid girl from Boston was completely gone, forever replaced by a highly respected senior operative who commanded a division of the smartest cyber investigators in the entire country. The bustling hum of the federal agency outside my thick, soundproof glass doors was the exact kind of chaotic energy that fueled my brilliant mind. Suddenly, the secure red phone on my desk chimed loudly, breaking my deep concentration. I picked up the heavy receiver and heard the gruff, serious voice of my director echoing through the encrypted line. He did not bother with pleasantries, simply stating that we have another incredibly corrupt billionaire trying to illegally hide massive illicit assets through a complex web of offshore shell companies. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, feeling a familiar, thrilling surge of pure adrenaline course through my veins. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face as I looked at the scrolling green data on my primary monitor. I rested the phone against my shoulder and let my fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard, bringing up the secure targeting protocols with lightning speed. I spoke directly into the receiver, my voice echoing with lethal, confident anticipation. Let's go hunting. The greatest lesson here is that your true worth is never defined by toxic family members who only see you as something to exploit. True security does not come from begging for approval or clinging to a fake legacy, but from quietly building your own independence. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who want to tear you down, you discover the absolute freedom to write your own ending. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relative to protect your peace? Share your journey in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of survival.